Hey everyone, welcome back. Dave in History for the Ages here. So I have another topic, Nero, a great story, of course. I've never done a video on him, so I thought this would be pretty cool. And there's a lot of documentaries that are really long, that gives you like an hour detail on every element of his life. I just want to do something more kind of a general overview for people who may not know much at all about Nero, a good place to start. And it's quite a dramatic story. He had a pretty extravagant type of life, to say the least. And so we're going to kind of go through some of the highlights here of his life. So let's start with how he comes to power. So the story of how Nero comes to power, we have to talk about very briefly Claudius. So who is Claudius? Claudius was the Roman emperor before Nero. Claudius had a son of his own named Britannicus. Now, my guess is none of you have ever heard of the Roman emperor named Britannicus. Well, because there wasn't one. And the reason was, even though Claudius had the son named Britannicus from an earlier marriage of his, he will get married again. And when he marries his fourth wife, a woman named Agrippina or Agrippina, I've heard it pronounced both ways, she already had her own son named Nero. So Claudius has a son from an earlier marriage named Britannicus, who's younger than Nero, and Agrippina, his fourth wife, has this other son named Nero. So Agrippina was very ambitious, and Agrippina wanted to make sure her son Nero becomes the next emperor, not Britannicus. So what does she do? Well, there's some very interesting circumstances at the death of Claudius. The story is that Claudius died of being poisoned mushrooms. That he ate a poisoned mushroom, and this was all orchestrated by Agrippina. And when this happened, Britannicus was still pretty young. Nero was 16. And so people look at this and they oftentimes say, could it have been not poison? It could have just been a coincidence. Maybe, but it would have been a very odd coincidence, because if Britannicus was a little bit older and then Claudius died, it would have been a lot harder for Agrippina to try to get Nero into power. But because Britannicus was several years younger than Nero and she was his wife, immediately she pushed Nero to become the emperor. And initially, she actually even tried to rule as joint ruler. This is a kind of cool little coin you see here, I put up here. And you can see on the coin, she has her face with Nero's face. And so, that's basically how Nero comes to power. It has a lot more to do with his mom, Agrippina, kind of manipulating the whole dynastic system to allow her son Nero to become the emperor instead of Claudius. Now, instead of Britannicus. Now, it didn't take long after that, when Nero comes into power, for bad things to happen to Britannicus. He is killed about a year later, 55 AD. And then things get really crazy, because Nero then really starts to not like sharing power with his mom, and he eventually has his mom killed. There's one kind of story that he actually built a boat for her, and he designed the boat to sink, and she got on the boat, but she didn't die that way, so he ended up having her killed another manner. So he's going to both kill his brother and his mother. And he did that because he didn't want to share power with anyone, obviously. And so now he's kind of the sole ruler, right? His mom is gone. He doesn't have to worry about his brother. What does he do? Well, a few pretty outlandish things. Now, we have, some primary sources on Nero. Suetonius and Cassius Dio are a couple of them. I always tell my students, whenever you see anything by Suetonius, I put his name up there so you could see, that a lot of the works by Suetonius sometimes are a bit exaggerated, but we also have enough other evidence from enough other sources that really do capture a picture of Nero being a bit eccentric, right? That he would literally go around beating people up. That was just kind of a fun hobby for him. All sorts of really lewd behaviors, which I'm not going to go into all the details on. And he loved spending a lot of time with actors and singing and shows. And this was seen as very kind of lowbrow for the Romans. The acting community was kind of seen as lesser in ancient Rome. And so for the emperor to be involved with that is not a very good image. And so there's a lot of these kind of stories about him doing this. He loved the show. He loved the Olympic Games. Another kind of funny story is during the Olympic Games, there was a chariot race, and He fell off the chariot race. He didn't even finish the race, but he still won the first place. It's good to be emperor. And there are other stories like when he gave his shows in the theater, people weren't allowed to leave during his show no matter what. You just had to stay there until it was over because he wouldn't want anybody leaving. So he had this kind of notion of just wanting to be a showman. That's what he was a lot about. So that's a big part of his reign, of course. That's what a lot of people know him for. He's also known for, of course, the Great Fire. So in 64 AD, there was a huge fire in Rome. And there's this, of course, legend that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, is that true? No, actually, it's not true. It wasn't as though, first of all, the fire was not Nero's fault. That fire was going to happen sooner or later, the way Rome was built. And so he also didn't just sit around doing nothing. He did measures to try to deal with it. And even rebuilding things after Rome, he had some plans that, to build things that made some sense. But because of his reputation, perception is sometimes more important than reality. That he was just more of a caring about the show and the games and all of that. It was very much perceived, at least, that he was maybe not at fault, but didn't deal with it well. And Nero wanted a scapegoat. And so, of course, one of the groups that he put to blame were the Christians. And so this is actually a pretty pivotal point of Nero's reign, because when he starts to blame the Christians, this is kind of the, Christianity 64 AD now, year 1 AD, of course, when it all gets going. And, this is where you see a lot of the persecutions of Christians. And we're going to see a lot of persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire until at least the time of, we get into Diocletian and Constantine when things change. I actually have a really interesting video. I'll leave the link in the description on Constantine and the Edict of Milan and when things start to change. But that's not till like 300s, 312, 313 AD. So there's a long time the Christians are going to be persecuted in Rome, and at least part of that is because of what Nero began here, blaming the Christians for the fire in Rome. So what happens to Nero? How does this keep going? Well, eventually his fall is a fewfold. A lot of the senators kind of get upset with him. They just don't like his behaviors. There were also issues in some of the province areas and the border areas, in areas around Spain and Gaul specifically, and I'm assuming everybody, maybe you don't know, Spain over here, I'll circle it, and Gaul, this is kind of the area of Gaul, what we think of as a lot of modern day France, Gaul, hopefully you can see that well. But in those areas of Spain and Gaul, there were some rebellions that broke out. He loses support from generals. And there were just some people who just, obviously didn't like his behaviors. At one point around 66 AD, he took this long trip over to Greece, and, they just, just to kind of enjoy and live his art and music and all that kind of stuff. And eventually people got tired of him, and he was condemned to death. He had to flee Rome, where eventually he killed himself. And so when he finally dies in 69 AD, he was also the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so then there's kind of this little mini civil war that follows, and then a new dynasty emerges called the Flavian dynasty, obviously not for this particular video. But that's just kind of a few highlights and crazy parts of the story of Nero. I just want to do something quick under 10 minutes. If you have more questions about Nero, just leave them in the comments, and I'm sure I can kind of get you the answer to those questions. But, hopefully you enjoyed that and learned a few things about this pretty famous, well-known emperor who is also a bit eccentric. All right, I got a ton of other stuff on Rome. I've got a whole playlist on the Roman Empire. You could watch that as well. Thank you for watching, and everyone have a great day.